Thank you very much, Ken. So these are specific questions then on the talks we've had since tea break. So who would like to start? Yeah.
For John, is this on? It's coming on. It's coming on. Check, check. I'm allowed again. Check. I realize it wasn't your experiment, so it might be difficult to answer, but that gravel rearing on subsequent, that is phenomenal. And I'm just wondering if you recall, at what stage did they remove those egg Alvin fry from the gravel? Did they have any swimming experience, or was it literally Alvin that had spent time in gravel?
To undergo first feeding before they move them into the gravel phase, because that's a really critical life stage, and if you don't do it right at that particular moment in time, you may have some trouble. And where they were putting the complex group and the simple group together at the same time, that would be my guess, but I would encourage you to contact the authors on that.
I will do.
Okay?
Hi, I've got a question for John Gibb. It was just wondering if you thought about active tracking and tagging in the Lochie. You gave salmon farms quite good bashing there, probably rightly so. But quite widely it's shown that where you have sea locks, kind of like in your situation, that there's a huge amount of natural mortality through predation in both fish and avian predators, and that maybe with the tracking you could actually see where the fish are dying, if they're generally interacting with the salmon farms. And it's quite interesting with the towing is that are they being towed past predators, or are they actually being towed past the sea lice and the salmon farms?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I didn't really have any time to go into it, and I won't now, but one of the key things that we're going to be looking at is exactly that. Is actually using this smolt program to, I think you'd have to ask our biologist, but I believe it's using acoustic tags to look at the issue of predation in the estuary. And one of the things that came out of a recent visit to Norway that I did was they were losing, or they believed they were losing, a huge amount. I can't remember. I think it was something like 60% of their smolts they believed they were losing to predation rather than sea lice, because these were slice-treated smolts. So it's going to be a key part of what we take forward from now.
Stephen.
I've got another question for you, John. You mentioned earlier in your talk that you had no sea trout run and there were more brown trout in the river. And then you showed that there was a considerable mortality of sea trout smolts. Is there some link between this? Have the trout evolved to stay put to the detriment of everything in the river?
Well, all I can say to that is practically every significant river in the whole of the Lochaba region, so that's the region where I work, has this issue of, and this is, to be honest, it's anecdotal this, but it's pretty overwhelming, is we have now resident brown trout populations that we never had before, and particularly the average size. And it is definitely our belief that one of the major predation issues in most of the rivers probably, but certainly on the Lochie, is resident brown trout. We actually think that there has been a shift away from migrating behaviour over a number of years into resident fish.
One more on that session. If not, we'll take the opportunity to move on to the more general discussion to be chaired by Ken. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Before we start the general discussion, can I just make a few announcements, because I know people may have to leave for various reasons. Just to give you some idea of what's happening this evening, because you haven't finished yet. At 6:30 we're having the poster session, and then 7 o'clock is the part of the meeting you've all been waiting for, when you get a free drink. At 7:30 to 8 then we're heading in for dinner, and just to make the point that at dinner there is no wine provided at dinner, so if you want to have something to accompany your dinner, you'll have to organise that between you at the various tables. The other point to make is you've seen, I'm sure, that we have been videoing proceedings. We'd also like to try and put together some news clips in terms of people's reactions and so on. So you'll find over today and tomorrow you may be approached, and if you're interested, we'd be delighted to get you on camera for a few moments, just giving your views in terms of exactly how you feel it's going. And it'd be nice to get that during the day rather than something that was prepared, if you like, for tomorrow afternoon. So again, your patience and your indulgence in relation to that would be very much appreciated. So in terms then of this, the final session, we had it down for a half hour, but certainly we want to try and finish, if we can, at the latest around 6 o'clock. Tomorrow we plan on quite a structured discussion session at the end, because certainly we need to have some very concrete outcomes. Hopefully it's clear at this stage that this is very much a dialogue meeting, and if it's a dialogue meeting, well then we really need to dialogue with some very, very careful structure put in place for tomorrow afternoon and some clear outputs. And certainly from the organisational point of view and the organising committee's point of view, what we'd like to get tomorrow is basically a set of recommendations really that we could give to our friends when we leave here and we go back and we meet people that haven't been here today. What can we tell them if they're interested in doing something about their river and they have this gut feeling, this really serious feeling that they need to do something about stocking? What are the steps we're actually recommending to them in terms of what approach they should take? Who should they actually ring? Who can they contact? What's the formats that we should be using? So I think we've got a very good insight into that today. Also, just to lay emphasis on the fact that tomorrow it's not near as heavy in terms of speaking from the podium. There's a lot more opportunity for discussion and for debate tomorrow, and that's the way the programme is designed. So hopefully you'll take full advantage of that. I think it might be very interesting at this point if anybody that has a real burning need to make a statement, that we give them an opportunity to do that. If you like, there may very well be views here that are very strongly held, and people would like to make an opening statement in relation to tomorrow. So if there's anyone would like to do that, or indeed if there's anyone wants to pick up further on points that were made earlier in terms of the discussion, the floor is really yours. So I leave it open to you, and we'll just keep the discussion open for the period of time that you feel it's worthwhile. So any questions? Any comments? Any observations? Yes, Kyle.
I don't know if it qualifies as a burning statement, but I don't know if it qualifies as a burning statement, but I think it's important in all of our discussions that whether explicitly or implicitly, every statement is preceded by if the status and integrity of wild populations is a priority. Because most else is contingent on that. In some places it is, in some places it isn't. And what one does depends very much on whether that is so.
Thank you, Kyle. Well put. Any comments on that, or any additional comments? There's not a lot of burning going on at this stage, I think. Yes, thank you. There's one over there. Oh, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Paul from Welsh Water. I'll pick up a bit on what Kyle says. We have some stocking obligations, as many people know. But listening to this today, I'm wondering how we should be playing stocking in the wider context. Some people have talked about other populations, about shad and the like, and I'm thinking very much about the holistic approach of what we need to be doing under Water Framework Directive. How is stocking going to fit into that bigger picture of what we have to do of getting the right balance of different fish species within the river? Is it a cost-effective measure under Water Framework Directive? Because those are the big planning tools that will be available to us in the next couple of years. We're going to have to do things there, and my reason for being here, I suppose, is to get a feel for what are the right things to do in that wider context of the bigger environment and not just the fish stocking and angling environment. So I'd be interested to hear people's views on that.
Thank you. That's a very good comment. Certainly when we had our flows symposium about a year ago, Ian Cowicks went to great pains to pull us back constantly and say to us, look, salmon don't live on their own. And it was very important that somebody said that to us, and we mentioned it earlier, I think, in terms of the approach we're going to take. And talking to Peter Goff over coffee, he was mentioning that in the context of the Welsh Water Authority, they're brave enough now to say they're going to adopt an ecological approach. But as is the case with most of us, we're not absolutely certain as to what exactly that means. So, any comments on that? Yes, Steve.
In the U.S., we have paid a lot of attention to the other diadromous species, feeling that salmon are very dependent on the whole suite of species. And so in every river system, we focus on these other species. Now, shad are still abundant in some areas, and we have had some programs have instituted a hatchery program for shad. It seemed fairly effective on the Susquehanna River, which is not a salmon river, less effective in Maine, but we have had the advantage of having strong enough populations of shad and river herring and some other species that have allowed us to transplant without operating a hatchery. We try to be mindful of the stock structure and not move some fish from one stock to another area. But anyway, the transplantation, habitat improvement, and to ensure that fishways are not just designed for salmon. We know that salmon can handle lots of designs, but shad in particular and other species cannot. And so, as you see now in the U.S., we're really focusing on dam removals when we can do that, but when we can't, especially on the main stem hydro dams, making sure that the designs are compatible with all of the species.
Thank you. Yes, just back.
Dr. Wheeler, I'm here representing my community, and we've suffered too from diminishing salmon runs. I speak as a traditional commercial fisherman, and in the British Isles, there is many communities who have depended on salmon fishing for many hundreds of years. And I suppose the catalyst to bring us here today is we've seen 3 brothers and another friend of ours drowned in the last year, who would have been traditional salmon fishermen, and due to closures, the fisheries were forced into other areas. But I think it needs to be added to the mix when you're talking about what's wrong in rivers and what can be done. Because we were just talking here, in our river, there is an increase in brown trout as well. But the views of traditional netsmen don't be taken into account, and buyouts and that don't work, because it might have worked at sea where people had other options, but you're talking about families where multi-generational, handed down father to son, and we've seen campaigns in Ireland like Hands Off Our Salmon and this kind of stuff. And, my own family go back 6 generations. I can trace salmon fishing. And, we're like a lot of anglers as well. We mourn the loss of the salmon. We need them to live by, So I would like if I do nothing else here today, is just, that it would be on the agenda that, we would see ourselves actually as indigenous people, and that, it be taken into consideration in future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yes.
John Prince, an innocent bystander. Following on from that gentleman's comment there, I think it should be remembered or looked quite closely at what netsmen contribute to the economy of the salmon relative to the contribution made by rod fishermen. And it's considerably less per fish. It's horrendously less per fish. And overall, we've got to come out of ivory towers if we're scientists and get down to practicalities. It's the fisherman who provides the money for this research, basically. And as numbers of scientists increase, the fishermen expect a return from that investment. I sometimes doubt that they're achieving that.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Eric?
I think there's a very important point with regard to there is a role for the netsmen to play in advancing science, and I think the program of genetics that Ireland undertook while the coastal net fisheries were still there illustrates how that resource could be very effectively exploited to increase understanding of coastal movements, of stocks, and the ecology of the Atlantic salmon. And it's something that actually that Scotland, in closing it, net fisheries, has lost. Now, I'm not going to make a statement about whether it was better to have closed them or not to have closed them, but I think we need to realize that working together with netsmen does have big advantages, and I think Chris Todd at the talk yesterday in Edinburgh illustrated that point. I think we need to reflect on the advantages of having some net fisheries around on our coasts can actually help the in-river management as well, and let's not forget that.
Okay, thank you. I'm very keen to make sure, and I'm not in any way trying to stifle debate, very keen that we shouldn't shift too far into a discussion in terms of rods versus nets. I think it's a very, very valid point in the context of hatcheries supplementing stocks or other methods of enhancement supplementing stocks to make sure there's a higher surplus that can give more fish to the nets. But I really don't think we can move down the other avenue of debate, because we really want to try and keep focused, if we can, on this whole area of hatcheries. Yes. Jamie.
Hopefully my comment will be what you want then, Ken. My comment would be sort of just refreshing myself as to the title on the front of the book. Are we content to undertake stocking and perhaps have to face up to the fact that in some cases we may need to continue to do that for as long as we can imagine? I mean, my personal view would be that we should move towards sustainability, and that you probably guess from the nature of our work, I'm not a great advocate of it, but I've certainly seen some examples today where I can be convinced that under certain circumstances it has a really important role to play. But at the same time, I think that role has to be limited in time and effort. And if its demand is constant into the foreseeable future, then I would ask myself what would be the value of that, because it may just be better to do. And I'd like to ask John Carr about, is the are those the material that was put aside in the innovative funding, is that going to be cryopreserved? We might just opt to do that and wait till better times roll, and that's another debate to be had. If we just want to preserve diversity, why not cryopreserve it all and wait till some mystical time in the future when the land will be restored to its,
Yeah.
It's a big question, and I think we need to ask ourselves about, are we prepared to keep stocking ad nauseum, or do we want to move to a situation and put our efforts into situations where it can be done sustainably? Because we are all on limited time, resources and money.
Okay,
Sorry,
Jamie.
that was rather long.
Thank you. I'll let John take up that point. If I might make a supplementary to that, because I think it's an important one. It's one, I think John Gibbs's paper in particular emphasised, I think, the core element of perhaps one of the aspects we might discuss in detail tomorrow. And this is the whole question that Ted raised really in a paper that he gave at the Salmon Summit in La Rochelle. If we were in a situation where, in the context of climate change and so on into the future, we had to sustain fisheries, as distinct from supporting and trying to enhance the wild stocks, I think it's really important that we don't confuse two things. I think we really have to have a separate discussion, I would suggest, in relation to the whole question of fisheries and what we want to do about fisheries, because there's clearly several options. We can actually look at the surplus of wild fish and we can try and run our fisheries based on the surplus of wild fish, or we can artificially produce a large number of fish by ranching and so on, which we'll hear about from the Ranga tomorrow. So I think we need to be clear when we're saying about stocking and so on. Are we talking about stocking to support and to protect wild stocks, and assuming that leads to a surplus? Or are we in a situation where we're trying to do this, and we need to be very honest about this, in order to catch more fish? either commercial fishing or in terms of rod fishing. I think that separation very often is confused, and I think it would be a great opportunity over the next few days to try and tease that out so we can get some consensus in relation to that. John, did you want to answer that particular point, John Carr? Yes. Yeah. Sorry, just wait until we get you a microphone. Thank you.
So, Jamie, your question was about cryopreservation? Yeah. To my knowledge, I don't think it's going on yet. It's on a full-scale thing. I think they've done some little bits of it, but they haven't gone full-scale. The Interbay captive rearing program is going to be up for review in the next year and a half. It's been going for about 10 years now, and there's going to have to be some decisions to be made because obviously it's quite an expensive program. It has worked to date in terms of maintaining that genetic database, but how long can you go on with this? Because if they're to pull the plug tomorrow, they would have no fish in the river. So are they going to continue to do that, or should they go to the route of just preserving it, cryopreserving, and then just going on from there and looking at other things? There is a few projects up and coming. The Interbay fundy stocks, I don't know if everybody's aware or not, but this is a unique stock that doesn't go to Greenland or off the coast of Labrador. They actually stay in the Bay of Fundy, Gulf of Maine area. So we know that that sea mortality is happening relatively close to home. We're hoping to get a tracking program going in that particular region soon, looking at not only salmon but other predator species like tailing, shark, tuna, and such. So we're hoping that the program will continue for at least the next 4 or 5 years so that we can start addressing some of those at sea mortality issues. But in the long term, cryopreservation may be the way to go.
Thanks, John. Any further points? We're coming up now towards 6 o'clock. I think we've had a long day. Any other burning issues or points to raise? I don't see any. Well, with your agreement then, what I might do is close the meeting, and only remains just to thank everybody who was involved today, our chairpersons and our speakers, to wish you all a very enjoyable evening. Hopefully the debate will continue, and we'll see you all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and a little bit later then at the poster session at 6:30. Thank you all very much indeed.